So I went ahead and loaded a bubble into my reference image palette, and the first thing I want to do is make some observations about this bubble before I start. Now what I notice is that there's kind of a horizon in the image in this bubble, and this bubble is reflective, so it's reflecting the environment that's around it, and the environment that's around it is a lot of different trees and a sky. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a lot of trees here. That's what this dark stuff is. And up here's the clouds. All these colors are what's called color interference, and that's a property of light and a property of bubbles. But along this horizon line here, what's interesting is that objects are flipped vertically. You can see there's a tree here and a tree here. It's the same tree. Everything else is the same. It's a normal reflection, except it's flipped twice. It's flipped horizontally and it's flipped vertically. So what we draw on one side, we want to match on the other and flip it, more or less. So those are our observations. We can go ahead and get started here. We don't need to do a sketch because all we really need to do is make a nice circle shape. So we can do that by going to the rectangular selection tool and holding down with our pen until we get the second option, which is the elliptical selection. And we will tap with our pen and drag. And if we hold shift while we drag, we'll get a perfect circle. If you don't hold shift, you're going to get this oblong shape. So hold shift. We're going to do a pretty big bubble. We might do a couple, depending on how much time we have here. I'm going to put it maybe right here. I'm not going to worry too much about the composition yet because we can obviously move these around. I'm going to make a new layer and we'll call this Big Bubble. And we will go ahead and fill it using the paint bucket with current color selected. And since this doesn't really have a color, it's kind of hard to say what we're going to fill it as. So we're going to have to decide on a background color, but for now, let's go ahead and make it a light gray. We'll do a Control D to deselect. Let's go back to the canvas layer, and let's create a new layer and call it background. So I think we might as well just kind of go with what we have in our reference here with a green background. So let's use the paint bucket again to fill the background with kind of a medium green color like this. Let's see if that looks all right. And let's zoom out just so we can kind of see our background kind of small, because since this background's not very detailed, it'll be easier to fill it in if we don't look at it too close. So what we want to do is we want to start picking some different green colors and use the digital airbrush to just kind of put them in. I'm really not thinking about this too much. I'm kind of just looking at the photo and trying to copy the essence of what's there. I'm not trying to copy it literally, but I'm going to use similar colors to what I see and similar shapes and patterns. I'm going to try not to do anything that's too sharp because I want all this to appear kind of out of focus. It seems like there's a lot of green, but I'm going to add a little bit of brown too because I think that'll help. Maybe some yellow areas, because this is probably trees and all kinds of things in the background here. Let's add some kind of darker blue for some dark areas. Okay, something like that will work. And then I think that it's kind of standing out too much, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it just kind of an overall wash of a dark color. There we go, that's better. Now we'll blend that a little bit using diffuse blur. Try to stay away from the edges of your canvas so that you don't get any accidental white fringe. And we get something like this. We don't want this to be the important point of focus in our painting. We just want it to be there. We could also use the coarse oily blender. Maybe we'll play around with these paper settings a little bit and try worn pavement. Try these settings that I have here. Just kind of tap and wiggle your pen around. I'll kind of break up the pattern a little more. We use diffuse blur again. There we go. Okay, so now we can go ahead and start doing our bubble. So we'll go back to the bubble layer. We'll turn on preserve transparency, and we can start adding some color to this bubble. Now, where it's darker, it seems to be more transparent So we may want to add a mask. Select black to paint with in our mask. Let's turn off preserve transparency while we're working on our mask, and we'll just click on our mask here to select it. And we will use the square chalk brush, and we'll use a little bit smaller of a brush than we normally use just to kind of sketch in to roughly divide this bubble here so that we have an idea of where we want to put our different objects. So we're going to map out that there's a tree here and we want it to be reflected over here on this side. And then let's say that there's some bushes that kind of go like that. So we want to try to match that on the other side. And with a bigger brush, we can go ahead and fill this in. Now it looks like I'm painting with green, but really what I'm doing is I'm concealing that layer so you can see through to the background. This doesn't have to be completely identical. You just want to get a feel for these general shapes. Something like that looks good. I'm going to put some more kind of darker stuff up here that kind of curves around. It's a little tricky trying to match this. Okay, those dark areas, I think that will work. And then let's go ahead and exit out from the mask by just clicking to the icon that's to the left of the mask on the layer here. Let's start adding some color to the bubble. So let's start with this yellow. Let's go ahead and just make the whole thing yellow so that we get rid of this gray color. We'll want to turn on preserve transparency. So we'll add this yellow. We'll add this white. Really bright highlight here. This is going to be really mostly about just adding in a lot of really nice colors. Try to kind of imagine that these are supposed to be clouds, these pink areas, and just kind of follow the photo here. It's blue kind of near the horizon. A little bit of green kind of in the center of everything. And there's some fiery orange over here in the corner. Just kind of hunting around in the reference image, looking back and forth between the reference image and my painting. I'm comparing one area to another to try to get a feel for how to shade this. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let's add a little bit more red down in here. Maybe a brighter red. And a little bit more of this hot pink here. Next we'll add another layer in between the big bubble and the background. Let's call this bubble BG, that's short for background. And what we want to do is we want to get a selection from this circle that we've already drawn. So what we'll do is we'll select the big bubble layer, we'll right click, we'll do select layer content, and we'll go back to the bubble BG layer and we will do Control-Shift-H to hide the selection. And we'll use the airbrush to put in some kind of different darker colors here in the areas where there are these dark colors, or these places that we masked out. You just kind of want to change it up here and there. Try to keep them kind of on the darker side though. I think something like that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to go back to my big bubble layer and just put in one more color that I think I missed here. This kind of aqua color really helps bring everything together. Let's make a new layer. Let's call this bubble HL. This will be highlights that we will put on top of the bubble. So let's use, let's go with a kind of lime green. I'm going to go for this kind of center reflection that's on there first. Let's use the jitter airbrush for this. Just paint in kind of what you see in the reference image there. Let's put in some yellow kind of on top here. Just kind of obscuring it with a little bit of a haze. Let's switch to the digital airbrush. And I'm going to put a nice sharp white area here. These rim highlights really help this to look like a bubble, so you want to put in really thin highlights along the rim here. You can put them in with white or any color you want, and then you can vary the color later since it's on its own layer. This really helps it look more reflective. So there's some white area in there. I'm going to blend that a little bit using the coarse oily blender so it doesn't stand out so much. And I might kind of blend up this. The thing about highlights is sometimes you want there to be a good mix of sharp and soft edges. So I go back and forth between these two brushes because the coarse oily blender makes things sharper and the diffuse blur smooths them back out. So then you get a little bit of both. I'm going to zoom out kind of far because zooming out really helps you get a feel for whether or not that's going to start looking proper. I think it does so far. So let's go ahead and blend some more on the big bubble layer. I think what we're going to want to do is, if I try to blend now, since I did this masking, I'm probably going to get some white fringe. So maybe first what we'll do, we'll go to the background layer. And I realized that I kind of got out of hand with that blending earlier, and I got rid of too much of the detail in the background, so I'm going to add in a bit more. I'm going to do a Control D to deselect my active selection, and I'm going to put in those lighter areas because they kind of disappeared when I over blended there, and I think we need them for this composition so the background's not so boring. For shadows I'm typically picking cooler greens, and for highlights I'm picking warmer greens. Okay, so I'm going to try to blend this again and not over blend it too much this time, hopefully. So I'm using kind of lighter pressure overall. Circular strokes, kind of like I'm scrubbing it. Another thing you can do if you're having trouble with this blending, you can also go to the effects menu and focus, and then go to soften, and kind of pan your page to where you can see something here, and go to circular, and then increase this. That'll just blur everything in the background too, and I think that does a pretty good job for what I want. So now, since we're not going to mess with the background anymore at this point, and we need to be able to blend with the background, what we're going to do is we're going to merge all of these layers together. So I'm going to select the top one, hold shift, select the bottom one, and then I'm going to do Control E on my keyboard, and that has merged them all into a single layer now. So we'll just call this bubble plus BG background, so we know that they're combined together. And let's blend it now using the diffuse blur blender. I'm going to blend lightly, and I'm going to try to follow the contours of a sphere when I blend. That's going to make it look curved. So I'm kind of spiraling in towards the center. Should still have this kind of swirling effect going on here. Now what we can do is we can go ahead and use the blur blender to soften along the edges because we don't want it to be so sharp. We can just blur it a little bit overall. Zoom in so we can see it a bit better. Now we want to imagine that we're going to go inside this bubble and start painting the world that it's reflecting. So this is where all the detail is going to come in now. And we're going to use the coarse oily blender. Try not to blend outside of your bubble, just try to make some clouds and some tree shapes in here. So I'm going to blend, try to put some of that blue up into the sky, up into the pink more. You can drag the pink down into the blue. This all to really start swirling together now. This is the fun part here. Swirl it some on the opposite side. Try to copy more or less what you're doing on the top near the bottom as well. I mean, I know it doesn't exactly match, but I want it to look like it goes together. And again, I'm working with that flow, that general kind of spiraling effect. That's kind of how the bubble's flowing. Zoom back out. See if we're looking more like a bubble now. I think that we are. And let's just use the diffuse blur to do that same circular blend, going all the way around to soften the details. Let's add a new layer and let's make it a multiply blend mode. We're going to start adding some finishing touches here because I see some spots that we can add to kind of help this look more realistic. Kind of on the top edges of these highlights that we put in, these lighter olive spots, there's kind of some darker green like what I see here. So I'm trying to put in those little details because it's those little random things that you see really make the piece come together. Let's add some dark orange kind of up here to darken this. We're giving this piece contrast now by doing this. Okay, take down the opacity just a little bit, just so it's not being overdone. Let's create another new layer. I'm not going to worry too much about naming these because I'm probably going to merge them all again pretty soon here. Let's use that same light olive color. We use the airbrush. Just work on these highlights a little bit more. And throw in some light over here that got kind of eaten up. Just kind of hunting around for details. You can't really ever observe all the details at once, so as you're working on this, you got to kind of go from point to point, and that's kind of why I have a hierarchy when I do things. I try to start in one place and work towards another and have a logical progress. I don't always do that. Sometimes I just jump around randomly, but it helps when you have a process to follow. Now we just want to add in a lot of little fine details, stuff that you can see up close, but when we zoom out, you probably won't be able to see it, so don't worry about it looking really precise. kind of sampling colors that are in here already. And put in that little white that's getting lost there because that's an important little detail that's getting reflected. And I'm going to make sure that all this white that I have up here is very strong and very sharp. There's a lot of sharp contrast going on in here. And I see kind of a light pink area that needs to be down in here. Again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make this look like a painting inside of the bubble or a landscape inside of the bubble. There's some neon green over here. Really, the more colors you use, the better this is gonna look, because that's kind of the effect that is happening when the light hits the bubble. The light's getting scattered into a bunch of different colors. It's really an interesting scientific property of bubbles. It's kind of art within nature, art that makes itself. It doesn't need somebody to paint it. I think we will go back to this second layer that we made here, this layer 1, and I see maybe an opportunity to throw in some purple to kind of tint a few of these darker areas. I want to try to bring back some of these areas that got too covered up. I know I'm kind of working back and forth here, but sometimes that's the way you have to do it. Okay, zooming out again to see how we're looking. So now we will go ahead and we will just drop all of our layers. Layers drop all. I'm going to do a little bit more blending with the diffuse blur using that same swirling pattern. I'll use the coarse oily blender to blend this a little bit. Gotta have the right balance of sharp details and smooth details for this to look like a bubble. It's really, when I started doing it, I thought this was going to be an easy one that I could do quickly because it's just a bubble, but it's proving to be more difficult than I thought. Okay, now I think we are ready to add some finishing touches to this. So what helps a lot is to use the bulge brush. You want to make the brush about as big as the bubble itself, maybe slightly smaller, something like that. And you want to wiggle and do a very tight circle while pushing down pretty hard and try to keep it centered. And what we want to do is we want to inflate the image that's in the center of the bubble without really disturbing the outside of the bubble. Like that. Kind of starts to make it look more like a bubble. And if you want to, you can go through and kind of paint over it in some places using the bulge and the pinch brush. That'll help give it some sharper contrast in some places. And as a finishing touch to the bubble itself, let's add a layer for a glow. Let's make that a screen composite method, and we'll select white. We'll select the glow brush. And let's paint here in this lightest white area. That's going to be our reflection off of our bubble here, as it's maybe floating through the air. Maybe I went too strong with that. I'll back it down to about there. And then anywhere where you want to try to add some more sparkle to it, Go ahead and do that. I'm just kind of sampling these different areas here. We'll have some of that spill off of it. Zoom out again, see how I'm looking. Let's just bring this composition together by adding a vignette, and then we will be done. So our vignette will be a multiply blend mode. We'll use a dark blue for that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to vignette the edges. That'll just make this a nicer composition, and it will bring focus in towards the bubble itself. We don't have to keep it this dark. I usually do it too dark and then I back it off a little bit. Okay, so there you go. There is a semi-realistic looking bubble that I did pretty quickly using a few brushes here.